All right, good morning, everyone. We're now done with the housekeeping session for day 3. It's August 16th, 2023. It's now 9 a.m. We're going to have, again, our third day of the adjudicative hearing in the Horsehaven Wind Farm proposed project matter. I'm going to ask that we call the roll of the council members. Hopefully we have the chair plus 7 today. And again, any council member that misses part of the testimony can go back and review the video and or look at the transcript when that is posted. Can we call the roll of the council, please?
Yes. FSEC Chair.
Kathleen Drew, present.
Department of Commerce. Department of Ecology.
Eli Levitt, present.
Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Mike Livingston, present.
Department of Natural Resources.
Lenny Young, present.
Utilities and Transportation Commission.
Stacy Brewster, present.
For the Horsehaven Project, Department of Agriculture. And Benton County. Assistant Attorney General.
John Thompson, present.
All right, let me make sure all parties are on the line. I was able to connect with all of you previously during the housekeeping session. For the applicant.
Thank you, Your Honor. Tim McMahon here on behalf of applicant Scott Clean Energy, along with Ms. Stavitsky and Emily Schimmelfennig, and Ms. Schimmelfennig will actually handle the Morgan testimony this morning. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Harper, anybody else on for Benton County?
Ken Harper and Z Foster. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Reineveld, I see you there as counsel for the environment. Do we also have a roll call of folks for the Yakima Nation today?
Good morning. Thank you, Your Honor. Yeah, Shona Volkers for the Yakima Nation, also joined by Ethan Jones and Jessica Houston.
Thank you. And Mr. Rambrew, I see you there for TCC. All right, good morning, everyone. Council members, before we get started, I know on Monday, I asked you about any ex parte communications you may have had. And I think we discussed that a little bit in our session after Monday's hearing, just to go over procedural matters and how to handle things going forward and finding documents and the rest. I didn't ask yesterday. I didn't think there'd be anything overnight given our discussions on Monday, but I think it's appropriate before we break until next Monday for the adjudicative hearing to remind you of the rules for ex parte. You have a written guide about it. And I'll just ask now if anybody has something to disclose before we start today's proceeding. Just put an electronic hand up if you do. All right, I'm not seeing any. Again, I know that there are articles coming out in newspapers. The Tri-City Herald had a nice article about our public comment hearing for next Wednesday night. And we're getting phone calls based on that article. That Lisa Massengale's working hard to create the sign-up list and confirm all of the statutory requirements for commenters. So parties, we're going to be working, I think, on that public comment hearing with the county. Mr. Wendt has indicated many of the locals that are going to want to comment will be gathered in one space. So we're working on that and hoping the technology goes well. For today, council, we're going to be calling and hearing the testimony of Morgan Shook. As we talked about yesterday, the exhibits to have up for testimony are going to be 1008 sub T revised. And then there are a sequence of other exhibits, 1009, 1010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And I think I might be leaving out one other one. Mr. McMahon, Ms. Schimmelfennig, is there any others after 1020?
Yes, Your Honor. It's 1051R, which is the report testimony.
Excellent. I knew there was one more. All right, thank you. Chair Drew, you have your hand up.
Yes, Your Honor. Given the conversation over the past couple of days, particularly the interest of the council in understanding more about the dryland wheat agriculture, I'd like to ask if we can recall a witness.
All right, so
Christopher, go ahead.
which witness would it be?
Christopher Wiley, Exhibit 1035R. And I have specifics in that testimony that I think are especially pertinent. Page 5, lines 3 through 18. Page 8, line 8 to page 10, line 25.
All right, if I recall, parties, we adopted without any cross-exam from the parties, Mr. Wiley's testimony first thing Monday morning, according to the schedule and my recollection. And there were no questions at that time posed by the council members. Chair Drew, what came up other than the specific pages and lines you decided? You have a general, what caused you to think that we needed some questions?
There was not sufficient information, in my view, from the Benton County witnesses about the use of that property and its relationship to the project, and how that might be coordinated from the perspective of a landowner.
Okay, and if I'm understanding correctly, then when you heard more testimony about that, now you have questions for that witness, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Got it. So parties, it sounds to me like Ms. Cook's testimony, which was very informative yesterday on all of these aspects that Chair Drew just mentioned, raised some questions. Let me ask the applicant first. Ms. Schimmelfennig, I don't know if you can speak to that, but would it be acceptable for the applicant to reach out to Mr. Wiley and see if there's a day next week we could fit him into that proposed schedule that everybody's working on? Council members, we had an extensive discussion about how the schedule will shake out next week. So I think we'll be able to work this in. I may ask you for some flexibility on running a little late on Tuesday to make sure we stay on target. And we may have a little bit of dancing around to do on Wednesday afternoon before our public comment hearing, but I still want a solid break in there. So council members, if we're gonna recall a witness, and hopefully there won't be a lot more of that, we'll see as the evidence develops. But Ms. Schimmelfennig, with that long preamble, do you think we could find a spot for Mr. Wiley?
Yes, Your Honor. We are reaching out to Mr. Wiley right now to see when he would be available next week.
Parties, I'd love to give great latitude to the council on this. I know you've had your opportunities and didn't have questions for Mr. Wiley. Does anybody have a concern about recalling a witness for this limited purpose?
Well, I do, Your Honor. Ken Harper for Benton County. It strikes me as, I guess, somewhat irregular for one of the members of the council to essentially ask one of the parties to develop the case further. The parties are litigating the case. Mr. Wiley's testimony, his pre-trial testimony, was what he and Scout chose it to be. We built our response testimony in relationship to that. If Mr. Wiley is recalled, we'd like an opportunity to provide rebuttal testimony, but that seems like that's a fairly inefficient issue. I understand your point, Your Honor, that the council should have information. On the other hand, we all also are working within a judicial context here. So if we go on this route, we would like an opportunity to provide rebuttal.
Understood, Mr. Harper. Is there, I mean, you said it was irregular. Is there anything in the Administrative Procedure Act or some other rule of the council you could point to about rebuttal testimony? I have, obviously, I'm hearing this now. I haven't looked at the council rules, but my normal administrative procedure is to limit rebuttal testimony. But here, I think the sequencing of things may have, if I understand Chair Drew correctly, raised questions yesterday that just weren't in her mind on Monday.
Well, Your Honor, I guess I can't speak to the APA. I'd have to research it. But in ordinary trial practice, I think it would be reasonable to say that, at least on this topic, Scout rested its case with respect to the testimony it offered on land use compatibility and consistency. We supplied our response. Scout didn't seek to rebut, so that should be closed. But I realize also we don't want to be that rigid. So I get it. And again, Your Honor, if the ALJ, if you wish to accommodate Councilmember Drew's request, which I totally understand, we just like an opportunity to rebut.
I think that sounds fair, Mr. Harper. Let's wait and see what develops. I do think it's best, and not just because it's Chair Drew, but also because it's a council member that's interested. Yesterday afternoon's questioning, but from council members, I thought shows you a lot where things are going. And I think it benefits not only the council to get the best information, but for purposes of post-hearing briefs, the questions probably telegraph the issues that the council wants to know more about. And I'd rather have both of those points well serviced by recalling Mr. Wiley. It doesn't sound like Chair Drew has an expansive part of his testimony to delve into. And if Chair Drew, if you didn't write it down before, why don't you recite those? I appreciate you being specific as to what you want to look into. This will address, I hope, Mr. Harper's concerns, and maybe Ms. Cook can be available to listen. And if there's any rebuttal testimony from her or Mr. Wendt, we can again try to funnel things down.
This is specifically about how Mr. Wiley would use the additional lease payments, which were answered very differently by Ms. Cook. That's why I would like to bring him into to recall his testimony. And it's page 5, lines 3 through 18, page 8, line 8 to page 10, line 25. Ms. Cook said she didn't know, and this testimony is specifically about that issue.
Your Honor, if I may provide a response.
If you need to.
Just to offer one other thought. Hi, everyone. This is Ariel Stavitsky. I'm sorry, we're shifting around here to try to minimize echo. The way that we interpret the rules, the applicable rules here under the APA and under the FSEC adjudication rules is that, all along we've reserved the right to provide rebuttal witnesses in response to live testimony that we heard today. So to the extent that Chair Drew would like clarification on content that came out of Ms. Cook's testimony, another way to think about this is that Mr. Wiley is Scout's rebuttal witness in this back and forth, and that's the way that this would be handled typically under the FSEC adjudication rules.
Well, Your Honor, that's fine.
Hold on, Ms. Harper. Ms. Shimofengi, you're referring to the rules in general. Do you have a specific one, or is this just sort of we think that's how it runs in FSEC? Because as Mr. Harper said, in ordinary litigation might be one thing. I don't know that any of the 5 parties in front of a large council is possibly labeled as ordinary litigation.
Agree. I can provide that citation to you. I need to look it up, but I can follow up with that, Your Honor.
Okay, if it exists, I'll be happy to get it. And I think you can circulate that in an email directly to me with the parties. Thank you. Mr. Harper?
I was just going to say, Your Honor, if Mr. Wiley was intended as a rebuttal witness, he could have been designated as such. But nevertheless, I'm happy to again, to accommodate and just ask that we be allowed an opportunity to provide some rebuttal.
All right, I don't want to. Yes, I will get to you just in a moment, Mr. Rambrew. I don't want to have the reserved right to present rebuttal testimony beyond what was submitted in that 3rd round of pre-filed testimony to go too far. But again, I'm for the parties, you've all had the 3 rounds of pre-filed testimony. We've been working on the schedule for that since March, April, and May, when it was decided at the 3rd pre-hearing what the exact filing schedule would be. The council, of course, is getting those on the fly as they come in and really preparing in the last couple of weeks. So I want to give deference to the ultimate fact finders here who will be making the recommendation to the governor. And I appreciate what Mr. Harper, what you've said about, well, he could have been designated rebuttal. He's not. He was a 1st round pre-filed testimony. This is a limited recall of that first round testimony is what I'm granting. So I just want to be clear with the parties what accommodations I'm saying. Yes, Chair Drew, this is good. Frankly, it was the first day of the hearing as well. And this is a new council. This is a new question of what's our role and how do we ask questions? And after yesterday, I think they're warmed up. So this may be just another thought of, oh, I wish I had. And this time I can be the genie in the lamp and grant the wish. But there's only 2 left in the lamp. Mr. Aramburu?
With all due deference and respect to the chair, I'm not sure. I think I will object to the testimony about what an individual person might do with individual monies that they receive. You've been very strict with us to talk about economic feasibility of the project. And this is what a private owner would do with his money. I'm not sure how relevant that is to any individual person. And persons may decide to use the money to buy farm equipment. Others may buy a new RV. Others may take vacation. And I don't know that that's necessarily relevant to the proceedings. But I will also note that if we're going to start to talk about what individuals are going to do with their money, I just want to alert everyone that I'm going to be asking him about how much money he's getting. I'm going to ask him about what he knows about the project. I'm going to ask him a bunch of those questions. So I think those are fair questions to ask, but I just want to alert everyone if this individual is going to come up, I'm going to ask those kind of questions. But I do believe that the testimony of an individual as to what they will do with their money is not relevant.
I'll only say, Mr. Rambert, that Ms. Cook went into quite a bunch of detail of what she thought individual family members might do. That's my recollection of yesterday's testimony. As much as she didn't talk about individual dollar amounts, I'll have to think about that, but it could be quite relevant just to take a look at things. But the testimony yesterday, as I remember it, has a lot to do with whether restoration could occur. I asked specifically about the costs that might be involved in a more governmental body trust fund about that. So financials may very well be relevant, Mr. Rambert, depending on the questions that Chair Drew asks. So we'll definitely see if it raises any additional questions for the parties. That's a fair preview of, again, where TCC stands on this. I appreciate it. All right, Chair Drew, we will recall Mr. Wiley. We'll find out what day. The parties are actually working on an update to next week's schedule. And once it's circulated to me and I take a look at it, we'll have Ms. Massengale post it on the council's version of the SharePoint website so you can take a look and see what, if any, changes. I can tell you that Monday, where you're preparing for that over the weekend, won't change. So Monday's schedule is kind of locked in from what was already on the website, and we'll go from there. Chair Drew, anything else on the Wiley recall, as you can see how the procedural discussion that followed?
No, thank you, Judge.
All right, well, we'll see when Mr. Wiley's available. Thank you, Ms. Schimmelfennig and Ms. Stavitsky for looking into that. And again, for the parties, less latitude on the reserves, rebuttal witnesses, or any concept the applicant has of their reservations. We've got pre-filed testimony. This is a limited recall. Council members, this is your reminder to ask your questions as soon as possible. So as things develop, we'll see how things go, but try to ask the questions you have up front, and we'll definitely finish on time next Friday. That's the projection. All right, I think now at 9:19 a.m. we are ready to call Morgan Shook. And I'll see if Mr. Shook can appear on one of my screens so I know who I'm swearing in. Good morning, Mr. Shook. Now I can see you.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you, and I take it you can hear me as well?
I can.
Excellent.
The court reporter is going to appreciate both of us if we don't speak over each other, and particularly if Mr. McMahon gets involved, if he doesn't speak over you. So we'll see how Ms. Schimmelfennig's training is at Stoll, and yours as well. The other parties are going to be starting with questions. If I look at what's expected today from what was off for the original Tuesday schedule, it looks as though It looks as though, Mr. Aramburu, I think you're going to start the cross-exam. Is that correct?
I think that's what the schedule says. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to read it. It's in a slightly different order, but because this is Scout Clean Energy's witness, you would do that. And then, Mr. Shook, you can expect that I'll ask the other parties if that raises any cross-exam for them, and then we'll come back for Ms. Schimmelfennig and eventually at some point go to the council members, as I've encouraged, if they have questions, they may have some things for you as well. Ms. Schimmelfennig, I'm going to ask you to go through that list of documents and exhibits and ask Mr. Shook if those are the ones he adopts. It's a little bit long for me to do, but I'll swear him in and they'll let you do the adoption. Mr. Shook, if you raise your right hand. Do you, Morgan Shook, solemnly swear or affirm that all the testimony you'll adopt in the course of today's proceeding, as well as your answers to any other questions, will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, thank you. Ms. Schimmelfennig is going to give you a list of the documents that have been pre-submitted, including your rebuttal or reply testimony, and have you adopt those, and then they will be admitted to the record. Ms. Schimmelfennig?
Good morning, Mr. Shook. Do you adopt exhibit 1008_T 1009 to 1020? And it's way easier to do 1051. I'm sorry, 1051_R. Those are the three.
I adopt those.
Thank you.
All right, we'll make those part of the record. And there may also be some cross-examination exhibits for you, Mr. Shook. One of them may have a number on it that was previously designated. And so Mr. Aramburu might refer to it as that, but we'll be assigning a new cross-exam exhibit as needed. All right, are we ready for Mr. Aramburu's questions?
I'm ready.
All right, I'll go mute on this end and Mr. Aramburu, defer to you. Ms. Schimmelfennig, if there's an objection, please unmute on your end, and Mr. Aramburu will listen to what you have, and then I'll go back to him for any response before I make a ruling. Mr. Shook, if you hear an objection, please stop, mercy on the court reporter, and we'll go from there.
Good morning, Mr. Shook. I'm Rick Aramburu. I represent the local citizens organization Tri-City Cares in this proceeding, and Tri-City Cares is an intervener. I have a number of questions to you about your testimony, background, experience, and those kinds of things. Mr. Shook, if you don't understand my question, please do not hesitate to ask me to rephrase it. And as Judge Torm has indicated, let's try whenever possible not to talk over one another, even though you may anticipate my question and I won't anticipate your answer as well. Are those good ground rules, Mr. Shook?
Sounds great.
And have you testified previously in trials or administrative proceedings?
I have.
Like over 10 times?
No.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit here about your background to begin with, and I have your testimony and references to the kinds of work you do. And it's indicated you're a research and policy consultant with Echo Northwest. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And would you consider yourself to be an appraiser?
I am not an appraiser.
So the testimony you're giving today is not based upon appraisals of property. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I understand. Appraisal, what property?
The properties that you're discussing down the Tri-Cities.
I'm not aware of any specific property appraisals in the Tri-Cities that I've reviewed.
Okay. And I've looked over your list of projects you've worked on, and they're very extensive list, even a couple that I've been involved in on the periphery. I am gathering that the principal amount of your work is to work for project proponents as opposed to project opponents. Do I have that right?
I'm not sure I understand that. If I had to clarify, my work is, I would say, on a range of different issues. If we're talking about specific administrative projects, I think it's been fairly balanced, particularly in the SEPA environment in the state, for working for both applicants and opponents of those applications.
Okay, and can you just name a couple of opponent projects where you've represented opponents?
Yeah, so I've represented the client is the Seattle Mobility Coalition that is opposing a set of comprehensive plan amendments to impose impact fees in the city of Seattle in 2018, and also again here in 2023.
Any others?
That's the only two that come to mind. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Chair. I want to talk about your experience over in the Tri-Cities. When is the last time you were in the Tri-Cities?
I was there about a month ago.
Okay, and what was the purpose of your trip?
We were working for my company, and my project I'm engaged with is working for the city of Pasco on its housing action plan.
Okay, and when were you in the Tri-Cities before your assignment with Pasco?
I don't recall specific dates, but probably a few months before. I've been there for a couple times as part of that project, and then was also there as part of another project working for the city on its downtown revitalization plan.
The city of Pasco?
City of Pasco.
Okay. Have you ever been to the Tri-Cities to look at the site for the project under question here?
When I was there a little about a month ago, I did make a point to sort of look at the site, or at least where I thought the site was, based on my sort of recollection of the maps while I was in Pasco.
And did you have a map in front of you to tour the site? That kind of investigation?
No, it's simply driving in.
Okay. And did you attend or look at any of the views that might be available at the Horse Heaven Hills from residences or businesses in the Tri-Cities?
Yeah, I mean, I would say specifically as I drove in, kind of contemplated the views of the site from my perspective.
That's driving along I-82?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me about what your understanding of the project is.
My understanding of the project is an application to site a wind energy facility, as well as potentially a solar facility on the property.
Can you tell me how big it is?
I don't have the details right off the top of my head.
So you don't know how many turbines are in the project?
Not specifically, but I know it's a large number.
Okay. And do you know what the length of the turbine rows are along the landscape in Benton County?
The length of the turbines?
Yeah, the turbine rows. There's rows of turbines in this project, isn't that right? Is that what your understanding is?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And can you tell me how long those turbine rows are in a linear sense?
I don't have
Objection, Your Honor. On relevance grounds, Mr. Schick's work is not site specific. His testimony is about the scholarship generally related to property values. We submitted testimony from Mr. Lines that provides a site-specific analysis and would recommend questioning him on site-specific questions.
Mr.
Okay.
Ramber, hold on. Ms. Schimmelfing, it sounds to me though, Mr. Ramber's asking not about specific sites, but the overall project and the roads. So this might be project specific, but that's what's in front of the council. Mr. Ramber, is that where you were going with this witness? A more general question about the roads?
About the roads and the project, yes.
So Ms. Schimmelfing, objections overruled. If Mr. Shook doesn't know the answer, it's not within his personal knowledge, that would be an appropriate response. But Mr. Ramber, if you want to re-ask the question in the context of the objection and my ruling.
So with regard to your knowledge of the project, do you know how long the turbine strings, the turbine lines are in the project?
Yeah. No, so I reviewed the project description, but I don't have that committed to memory. So I can't tell you specifically what it is. And I think most of my focus on this was really looking at the academic literature related to the analysis that was done as part of the application.
Okay. So you can't tell me right now how many miles of turbines there are.
I can't tell you that right now.
And I was looking at the pages of the updated application for site certification, and you've indicated you've read those pages.
Which document are you referring to?
In your testimony, you indicated that you had reviewed section 4.4 of the site certification application. That's on page 3, lines 13 to 15 of your testimony. Is that correct?
Can you recite which part of my testimony you're referring to again?
Okay, so I'm looking at your direct testimony and looking at question and answer on page 3, lines 10 to 15.
008. Sorry. For the council members, this was exhibit 1008_T. Is that correct, Mr. Aramburu?
Morgan, do you have it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
My apologies. Mr. Shook, do you have exhibit 1008 up, or would you like us to pull it up for you?
I have it up.
Okay.
And I'm looking at page 3 of 15.
So it indicates there that you're sponsoring portions of section 5.5 of the updated application for site certification. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I still don't quite understand your question. And what
Perhaps so we don't have confusion here. Yeah. May I ask that this portion of the testimony be brought up on the screen?
Ms. Massengale, are you available to do that today? It looks like she is.
Ms. Massengale, page 3, lines 10 to 15. I'm sorry, that's not the same pages that I have. Can you move further into the testimony, please? Okay, there we go. I guess it's page 6 here. I have the wrong version. Okay, up at the top of the vision on the screen is page 6 of your direct testimony. Lines 10 to 15 indicate that you are sponsoring aspects of section 4.4 of the site certificate application. Is that right?
Yes. So on line 13, yes, sponsoring aspects of 4.4, specifically discussions of property value impacts and information supporting that discussion.
And on those pages, you cite to various studies that were included in the testimony, but you did not write any of that yourself, did you?
That's correct. That's not my work.
And at pages 4-235 to 2-228, there's a citation to a number of studies that principally ones done by Mr. Van Honig. Do you recall that?
I don't recall specifically all those studies in that section, but I do recall they're referring to a variety of different academic research.
And in that academic research that's cited in the site certificate application that you're sponsoring, did you compare the current project with the projects that are discussed in on those pages of the site certificate application?
No, I have no formal comparison as part of that work. I was asked to review that section, review the studies that were the basis of those considerations, and provide my best professional judgment on sort of the adequacy and veracity of that for decision makers.
Okay. And have you done any investigation as to the preferences of residences in the Tri-Cities with respect to preferred views and preferred vistas?
I've done no such research.
Okay. Have you spoken at all with the Benton County prosecutor, excuse me, Benton County assessor regarding the aspects of residential value related to views and vistas?
I have not.
You'd be surprised to learn that, well, let me strike that question. In your review, have you examined the differing views that might be available to residences in the Tri-Cities area of the Horse Heaven Hills compared to other properties?
I'm not sure I follow that question. Well, can you rephrase?
Have you seen the Horse Heaven Hills?
I mean, as I testified earlier, yes, as part of the drive-in, I've looked up what I think the site is based on my recollection of those maps.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not residents of the Tri-Cities area would prefer to have a view of the Horse Heaven Hills as opposed to other vistas?
I don't have an opinion on that matter. I've conducted no original research on this, on that specific question.
Have you, at any time in your work, well, let me ask this question first. How many other wind turbine projects have you worked on?
This is the only project specifically looking at wind turbines.
Okay. Have you worked on any solar array projects?
I have not worked on any solar array projects.
So this is your first wind turbine project, correct?
This is the first time I've been asked to look at this issue related to wind turbines, yes.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the concept of place attachment in evaluation of properties?
Maybe you should explain what place attachment is.
My understanding of place attachment from my reading indicates that in certain circumstances, there's a bond between residences and familiar locations and topography. Are you familiar with that concept?
I would say doesn't seem like a foreign a foreign idea, that people would be attached to the places they live. Yeah.
Is it a subject matter that you've ever investigated?
I've done no original research on place attachment specifically.
Are you aware that it's a subject matter in research concerning property values?
I would assume that that issue potentially could be, yes.
Okay, but you haven't studied it in relation to this project.
No, I have not.
Would you consider that many residents of the Tri-Cities would consider the Horseheaven Hills as an iconic feature of the landscape?
I wouldn't doubt that some people do. No, that seems like a reasonable position to have.
Okay. Have you consulted with any interest groups in the Tri-Cities area to try to ascertain their concerns with respect to property values?
No, that was not part of my engagement here.
Okay. Ms. Massengale, could you put up Exhibit 5303, the last several pages, please? Okay, let's, and this is fine. Thanks, Ms. Massengale. I'm putting up I think it's the last page of 5303. That exhibit, per our prior instructions, has been, will be remarked as a cross-examination exhibit. And what has been put up here is a letter dated June 7, 2023, and written on behalf of the Tri-City Association of Realtors. Have you consulted the realtors with regard to their opinions regarding the impact of this project on property values?
No, like I said, that's not part of the scope of my engagement here.
Okay. Would you just take a moment to read the letter? Can you read it on your screen?
Can you make it a little bigger, please?
There we go.
One more for me. I'm on a small laptop here. Thank you.
Objection, Your Honor.
On
This
what
is-
grounds?
Yeah, thank you. This is not, the witness has already stated that this is not within the scope of their review.
Overruled. He can read it, and then we'll determine what his scope of knowledge might be or whether he's in a position to offer his opinion. So I'll ask Ms. Massengale to continue to
Thank you.
work her magic as she scrolls through this. Once you're done with the last paragraph on the page, Mr. Shook, if you'll let her know, she'll scroll down so you can complete it, and we'll go forward in that manner.
Okay, can you scroll down? Can you scroll down a little more? Thank you.
Okay, have you had an opportunity to read that letter?
I have.
Do you consider it important in assessing property values and impacts of projects on property values to consult with and seek the views of the realty community in a location?
Yeah, so in general, I would say, yeah, it's important to have a good sense of the issues, and you get a good sense of those issues by talking to a lot of stakeholders and other sort of professionals. And then I think we always want to then try to marshal the evidence as best we can, because these are complicated systems we're talking about. And so what can we else look at with respect to rigorous examination of the issues to sort of determine what we think the direction and size of the effects are?
But it would be fair to say that the realty community in Tri-Cities has expressed great concerns about the impacts of this project. Is that correct?
According to this letter, they have.
Okay. And Ms. Mazzigal, would you roll up just to the prior page? I think this is the last page of the exhibit. Let's go up a bit farther, past that letter to the next letter. Okay. I'm putting up on the screen another letter from Exhibit 5303, which is the letter from the Tri-City Regional Chamber of Commerce. Do you see that letter on your screen?
I can see it.
And have you worked in the past in your economic development projects for chambers of commerce?
I have.
And what in general do chambers of commerce, what are their interests in a community?
They vary depending on their charter and mandate, but generally I would say specialized economic development.
Okay. And would their views of a project be of importance in assessing the impact of the project on the community?
Their view would be one of many important perspectives to be incorporating.
Okay. Do you know what the position of the Tri-City Regional Chamber of Commerce is on this project?
I do not.
Okay. I'd ask, this is a little shorter letter, Mr. Shook, and I regret having to have you read this all the way through, but if Ms. Massengill, if you could allow Mr. Shook to read the letter.
You can scroll to the next paragraph. All right, scroll down. Okay.
In your economic development projects, do you consider it important to consider what the local chambers of commerce have to say about that project?
That's pretty wide. I would say in some cases, yes, some cases, no, depending on the issues.
Okay. Let's see. Roll up one more if you would, Ms. Massengill. Thank you for your assistance. In economic development projects you've worked on, do you consult with local governments from time to time?
We do.
And do you work for local governments?
I do.
And are you working for the city of Pasco currently?
I think currently that contract is finished, so I do not currently have an engagement.
But you recently worked for the city of Pasco, did you not?
Correct.
Okay. And so in terms of assessing impacts of a project, would you consult with local governments?
It would depend on what we were assessing, but in many cases, they are an important stakeholder because of their role in land use regulation.
You familiar with the city of Richland?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
I'm sorry, say that again, please.
Yeah, I'm familiar. I've done work for the city in the past, yes.
You have, okay. And is the city of Richland nearby this project?
I understand that it is.
Do you know that as a matter of fact?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Let's move up to the next exhibit, please, if we can. Ms. Massengill, you've been very helpful to us here. Okay, we're again looking at Exhibit 5303. Mr. Shook, have you ever worked for a organization that promotes tourism in communities?
I'm trying to think. We've worked with the state RCO office, which does some tourism promotion. We've worked with many cities that also take hotel tax funding to do economic development and tourism funding. So, but so various ones in that capacity.
And what's the RCO?
Oh, sorry, the Recreation Conservation Office for the state of Washington.
Yeah, but it's a state agency, correct?
Correct.
And assessing the economic impact of a project on the community, would it be important to you to consider what the impacts would be on tourism in that community?
So can you repeat that question again?
I said, in assessing economic development and impacts of a project, would you consider it to be important to consult with representatives of the tourism community in that vicinity?
I said it would depend on the issues, but yeah, tourism is an important sector within our state economy, and typically, depending on what the issue is, we more or less consult with those agencies.
Okay. And did you consult with those agencies with regard to your review of this project?
Again, the review of my project is limited to the impact on property values and the academic studies. I've done no further analysis or consultation with any of these groups, including Visit Tri-Cities, Washington.
Okay. And Ms. Vasco, if you just roll up this exhibit, please, for me, and allow the witness to read it. This will be the last reading exercise, Mr. Shuck.
Hopefully I'm passing here. Okay, you can scroll to the next paragraph. All right.
So the Tri-City Tourism Organization supports the work of my client. Do you see that from the letter?
I do see that.
Okay. And do you know what Tri-Cities Care's position is in this litigation or in this adjudication?
I don't know specifically its main points, no.
Okay. Now, let me just get back to your testimony a bit here. And I understand that your testimony is essentially supportive of the work that was done by others in the site certificate application. Is that right?
Yeah, my engagement was that I was asked to review that section of the application, as well as the number of exhibits of academic studies, and make an opinion on whether that information reflected the best available science and information on the question of property value impacts.
And you reached some conclusions on that point, correct?
I have.
Okay. I notice a lot of your testimony and some of the excerpts from the site certificate application deal with work by Mr. Ben Honig. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. Hoen. Is that correct?
Yes, his work is featured prominently given his expertise in this.
Okay. Do you know Mr. Honig?
I do not.
Okay. Did you consult with him on this project?
I did not.
Okay. So you simply read his academic papers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you read all these papers?
I read all the ones that are part of the exhibits.
And I may have the wrong page numbers on my exhibit, but Ms. Massengill, if you could go over to the exhibit, the testimony exhibit, which is 008 underscore T. Okay, if you could go down a bit, please. Farther, please. Keep going down if you would, please. Let's stop there for a moment. Yeah, this is on this page. I don't have the page number here. Page 9 on the PDF. Page 9, yes, page 9 of the application. You can scroll back up, please. You indicated reference to the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Page or line 9 through 14 on page 9. Is that correct?
Yes, I do reference that.
And have you worked with the Berkeley National Laboratory before?
I've never worked with them.
Do you know who they are?
Outside of their reading about them on their about page, that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Now, if we scroll down just a bit more, please. Keep going, please. A bit more, please. And a bit more. Okay, we'll stop here. Bottom of page 10 of exhibit 1008, you indicate that you've read the studies from the Berkeley National Laboratory. And then you say you have not conducted an exhaustive and comprehensive literature review of research involving impacts of wind turbines. Is that right?
That's correct.
Have you read anything about the impacts on property values of the siting of wind turbines other than what you've talked about here?
Just what I have here.
Okay. And did you attempt to search out whether or not there are studies that indicate an opposing view to what to the studies mentioned in your report?
I did not, but all those studies reference some mix of findings related to the issue of property value impacts. So I was aware of the fact that not all studies find that there's no long-term or consistent impact on property values.
Well, Ms. Bassio, could you roll up just a few lines for me so we can look at the next page? Yeah, I want between. Can you roll up just a little bit more for me so we get the 2 pages together? Just a tiny bit more. Okay. So I want to look at the top of page 11 here, and on the preceding page, you say, I am not aware. There we go. Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Massidel. Page 10 and 11. There's a sentence there. Said, based upon my general knowledge of disamenity research, I am not aware of other studies with conclusions that conflict with the conclusions of the Berkeley National Laboratory studies. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's what it says.
I think your testimony just now said that there are conflicting views, aren't there?
So the way we look at this stuff from an economic research perspective is trying to weigh the totality of the evidence. And in reading the research, it's been very clear that there are small studies that indicate that there are potentially some different findings, which all then warrants more robust and thorough examination of the issues. And so that was really the undertaking, of, as I understand it, of the Berkeley National Laboratory study, just to say, well, we see some different effects here in some places, but we don't see them in these other places. The sort of consensus of that information seems to suggest that there are no effects. And so let's take a look at that with much more sort of statistical power and rigor. And so that analysis, I would say, of the level of quality and comprehensiveness of the Berkeley report, there's no sort of study at that level, right, that has a conflicting sort of viewpoint conclusion on the property value impacts of a potential disamenity. Does that make sense? So think of it as basically there are different studies at different powers, right? And from a research perspective, you're trying to evaluate, did this one have enough power to be strongly suggestive, and then and build upon that. And so what the Berkeley report analysis is trying to do is take that information and say, well, we've seen some potential sort of conflicts here, but when we examine it much more robustly, we can't find any of those effects.
Well, that's all fine, Mr. Chuck, but your testimony here is pretty unequivocal. I am not aware of any other studies with conclusions that conflict with the conclusions of the Berkeley studies. That testimony isn't correct then, is it?
Objection, Your Honor.
You just clarified.
Mr. Shook just clarified and explained his statement made here.
It's Judge Shoreham, we're asking him on cross-examination of statements that he made, and I want to clarify what's in his direct testimony. I think it's a fair question.
As do I. Ms. Schimmelfennig, we need an evidentiary basis as to when you make an objection. This is cross-examination, and I think the point being made by Mr. Ramru is what's in pages 10 to 11 and what his subsequent testimony has been. If you think that needs to be rehabilitated on direct exam to give fuller context, you're more than free to do so. But the objection's overruled. We'll take this testimony.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the chance to clarify this, because from the reading of all those reports, it's very clear within the academic literature that there are other studies that find some level of property value impact, which is why the Berkeley Laboratory undertook a study of this nature and comprehensiveness and robustness to try to settle this issue. And so when we weigh those levels of evidence, what I'm trying to say in this statement is there's nothing at that level of quality that would, from my knowledge, that would conflict with that conclusion, right? So that's what I'm trying to say. At that par of analysis, there's no sort of similar analysis that was done that shows that there's impacts. But it's very clear in all those research, even within the Honig report, right, of saying like, look, there's this study, this study, this study. This is why we're doing this big study to help try to settle what we think the actual effects are.
Okay, but there are some other studies out there that disagree with what Berkeley filed, correct?
From my recollection of that study, right, they're very clear in saying the preponderance of the evidence they've seen is that there's no effects, but there are other studies that have shown some effects. So thus, let's look at this issue more robustly and more comprehensively.
Mr. Shook, I don't think you're answering the attorney's question.
Okay.
Are there any other studies, yes or no, that disagree with Berkeley?
Yes, and that's clear within Honig's own research in those papers. Yeah.
Mr. Rambro, I think you got your answer there.
Yeah.
So essentially what Berkeley says is that we're smarter than these other guys and we know better and don't pay attention to those reports. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think they said that anywhere in their report.
Certainly the import of your testimony, Mr. Shook.
If I had to try to characterize in the best available light of doing this kind of science, is that it's difficult, it's challenging. These effects are complicated, but we do have tools that are at our disposal to try to understand them more deeply. And so what the researchers at Berkeley are trying to do is say, look, there's a small study over here, there was a small study over here. Nobody's really looked at it in totality with large data sets in lots of different jurisdictions, lots of different settings, and try to understand that effect size. So what they're trying to say is, like, can we do this slightly better and provide more insight to this important issue?
And Mr. Schick, did you attempt to identify what those reports that disagreed with Berkeley's conclusions and review them in preparation of your testimony?
I did not review them in preparation of my testimony.
So you don't know how comprehensive or not they are, do you?
No, I've not reviewed those, so I can't make that determination.
Okay, thank you. I just submitted a cross-examination. I apologize, late this morning, and I think we marked it as 5903. And I apologize for that coming in late, but my examination of this witness was moved up a week. So do we have that document, Ms. Massengale? It was just this morning. Okay, and I realize this has come in a bit late, Mr. Shook, but have you had a chance through your counsel to look at this document?
I had a chance briefly this morning to take a look at it.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you, these are excerpts from a larger report, and I wanted to sort of hone in, and not a pun here, but about the work of Mr. Honig. So this is a report done by Mr. Honig in 2017. Do you recognize that?
I don't see the date on this.
It's, well, take it from me, it's at the very bottom of the page.
Okay.
Okay. If you go over to the next page, please, in the exhibit. And I brought up pages, I think this is it's page 2 of the PDF, but I think it's page 12 of the document. And Mr. Honig discusses positive economic impacts of wind energy. You see that?
I can see that.
Okay. And then if we scroll down the page a bit, under 5.1.2, he talks about negative economic impacts. Do you see that?
I can see that.
And he talks about a number of studies actually that Mr. Honig did in that paragraph at the bottom of page 12. You see that?
Which part are you referring to specifically?
Yeah, under negative economic impacts. I see that Mr. Honig seems to be citing himself in a number of these references. Is that right?
I see that. It's Hoen, or not Honig?
I don't know how he pronounces his name.
Okay. All right.
Okay, at the very bottom of the page, Mr. Honig, who's the author of this document, says there is evidence that home value effects might exist in the United States and in Canada, in Canadian context, cites reports. Do you see those?
I can see that.
Have you read those reports?
I have not.
Okay. Then he says there's growing evidence that effects, that is negative economic impacts from wind turbines, exist in the European context. Do you see that?
I can see that.
And if we scroll down a little bit, thank you. He's got research by a number of persons regarding the economic, about the European context. Do you see that?
I can see that.
Okay. And have you read those documents?
I have not.
Okay, then Mr. Honig, this is his paper, says more research in the area could not only untangle conflicting results, but increase understandings about how perceptions of property value influence acceptance. You see that?
I can see that.
Okay, so he's suggesting more work be done and that things aren't resolved. Do I take that from that sentence?
I don't know about the resolution part, but he is talking about more research could help
Okay.
angle conflicting results.
Okay. Now if we turn down, please, to the next page where we have keep going, Ms. Massengale. Appreciate your help here very much. Thank you. Let's go down here. And so this is table 1, summary of economic impacts on the relationship to wind energy acceptance. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we scroll down the page a little bit, please, Ms. Massengale, to the section on property value impacts. Would you just take a moment, Mr. Shook, to review what Mr. Honig says about property value impacts?
Yes, I'll just read it. Some large scale
No, you don't. You can read it to yourself. We don't read it.
Sure. Sorry, you just want me to read it?
Yes, if you would, please. I want to ask you a question or two about it.
Okay.
Okay, so Mr. Honig in this report says that there are robust longitudinal studies have not found evidence of impacts on home values, but other studies show a reduction. Do I have that correctly?
Is that other case studies?
Other case studies show a reduction. And then he cites, again, to some of his own work, but cites to a number of reports. You see that?
I can see that.
Have you read any of those reports?
Off the top, I haven't cross-checked whether any of those are also the ones that are any part of our exhibits, but I would maybe think the 2016 study, perhaps. I don't know, but I wouldn't have to. I don't know, but because I haven't cross-checked any of those against the reports that I've reviewed.
Okay. In your review of the academic literature here, have you explored whether there's any relationship between the number of turbines and property value?
I'm not aware of any of the research that looks at that. Doesn't mean that there isn't. I just not right at the tip of my fingers in any of the reports that I've looked at.
Does the research discuss any impact or any impact on property values from the size of the wind turbines?
I believe they do in some of the Hone report, they look at different sizes of facilities. If I recall correctly.
Are any of those wind turbine facilities mentioned in the Honig reports as big as the ones in the Horse Heaven Wind Project?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Do you know how big the turbines in the Horse Heaven Wind Project are?
As stated previously, I don't have that at my disposal.
Do you have any idea what the height of a typical wind turbine is from the ground to the tip of the rotor?
I believe, I don't know precisely, but I believe it's in the hundreds of feet.
Okay. There is some testimony, particularly at the top of page 7 of your testimony about there we go. I guess I'm working from a different set of page numbers as you are. This would be on page 10 of 15. There we go. At the top of the page, please. And you're mentioning some 2023 research by Berkeley Lab on property values of solar facilities. Do you see that?
I do see that.
Okay. And are there solar facilities connected with this project?
There are.
Do you know what the extent of them is in acres, square miles, whatever?
I do not have that at my easy recall. Sorry, I don't.
Okay, thank you. And from your trip along I-82 to go over to Pasco, you know if any of these large-scale solar projects, which are in connection with the Horse Heaven project, are visible from I-82?
I don't know from my trip to the extent that that's true or not.
Have you tried to figure that out?
I have not. It's not part of my engagement.
Have you asked the lawyers about that? Whether or not you can see the solar arrays from residences in the Tri-City area?
Again, my engagement was not to do an independent evaluation of the effects on property values of the project. It was to review the information that was presented and comment on its applicability and for decision making.
Okay. Let me ask this question in terms of the analysis here. Did your analysis include a consideration of the absolute number of persons or residences that might see wind turbines?
No, my analysis did not include that. Again, it's limited to the information that's presented.
Well, the information presented contains a number of analysis of impacts of wind turbines on residences, does it not?
Again, my review is related to the socioeconomic section, specifically on property values.
No, I understand that, but do any of those studies represent a impact on property values of the number of people who might view this project?
I guess I'm not following the question. Are you asking me, like, do I know how many people will have views of the facility?
Yes.
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Is that a relevant consideration?
For what?
For analysis of the impacts on property values of a wind turbine project?
Yeah, so views and proximities to the facility are the typically key variables when we look at sort of disamenity impacts of facilities. So yeah, that is an important consideration as part of the research that is done in this space.
So have you compared the impacts of this project with any of the specific circumstances involved in the other research?
I get in what regard? I mean, I'm struggling. Sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm not quite sure I understand. Like, what are you asking that what I compared to?
Have you compared? And I understand Mr. Honig has done various reports, and he's done some somewhat obscure statistical analysis about the impacts of the project on property values, and he's done that on some specific projects, has he not?
He's what? Sorry, I'm sorry.
I said he has done that, made that analysis on some very specific projects, has he not?
My understanding of his data set for particularly his large study looking at wind turbine effects on property values is kind of both multi-state with hundreds of thousands of real estate transactions, so across multiple settings.
Well, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but on page 4-236, of the amended site application. A couple of Honig studies are discussed. And page 236, one of them involves 24 wind turbines. Another one involves 12 wind turbines. Have you done the research to see whether or not those studies are relevant to a project that has many more wind turbines than those?
I believe those are relevant in the same way all the scholarship in this issue is relevant, I guess. And from a sort of, as you adjudicate sort of the nature and quality of the evidence, right? And I think this is kind of related to the point around the large scale Hone study that said, well, those are very small facilities. We have very few transactions. Can we look at a whole wealth of facilities and transactions around them in much different settings and determine whether or not we see effect sizes?
Did you reach out at all to the Benton County assessor to get his take on what the impacts of the wind turbines would be on residential or commercial home values, or residential or commercial facilities in the Tri-Cities area?
As I answered previously to that question, I have not reached out to Benton County assessor.
And you're right, I think that was a repetitive question. Okay.
Mr. Rambrew, how long further are you going? I know we had an hour plus, but I want to make sure if we're targeting 10:30 perhaps for a break.
Well, let me just have one moment here, if I may, and just let me look through my questions if I could. I think I'm just about done, Mr. Torum. So let me just see if there's any cleanup questions here.
Thank you.
Timely update, Mr. Torum. I don't have any further questions this witness. Thank you, Mr. Shook, for your testimony today. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you, Mr. Rambo.
Let me ask other parties if they have questions in cross-examination to let me know. We'll take them after a break, but I want to know if we're coming back to Ms. Schimmelfennig or if we're coming back to questions from other parties. Mr. Harper, did you have any questions on this you wanted to ask?
I have no questions for this witness.
Ms. Volkers?
Not at this time, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. And Ms. Reineville?
I don't have any questions for this witness. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, let's come back a little, well, let's come back right at 10:30 and we'll resume. Ms. Schimmelfennig with your redirect, if anything, and then council members, this will give you time to think if you have any other questions as well. All right, we'll be at recess for the next 7 minutes. All right, everyone, we had to take a little bit longer of a break. The project we were starting to get you yesterday's transcript excerpt of my ruling during the housekeeping session was, we needed to make sure we had everything right with that, but it's been sent to the court reporting agency and we expect it'll come back to all of you later in the morning. All right, Ms. Schimmelfennig, if everybody's back, and it looks to me that they are, we're ready for any redirect that you need to do with Mr. Shook.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Shook, I think a great place to start is with your qualifications. You kind of mentioned that you are not an appraiser. Can you explain your specific role and expertise?
Yeah, so I think the relevant expertise here really has to do with land development and understanding the effects of that. And in that space, I kind of have a unique perspective because I kind of wear 3 different kind of hats. I wear one as a basic researcher, doing basic research reports on questions. I also have a regulator hat where I work with local governments on land use regulation. And I also kind of have a land development hat, working for a number of housing and private entities doing land development. And in that space, we work on issues of particularly sort of the intersection of sort of market impacts of market research. So basically understanding the potential sort of market opportunities to execute on land development. We also work on the sort of financial viability of those things. But then we also work on sort of the we'll call it entitlement process, where we try to understand the unique set of impacts that these projects may have, and to work with agencies to disclose those things. So have a very robust and comprehensive view of the land development process and its different features, given the different roles I play for clients on those kind of projects.
Yeah, you're kind of mentioning these projects generally, and Mr. Aramburu asked you if you had worked on any wind projects before. Have you worked on other large scale or industrial projects, even if they might not be wind or solar?
Yes, I have worked on particularly siting of large scale data center facilities, as well as large scale distribution and logistics centers.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and also part of those related, also work on a range of government-related siting facilities related to transportation, either roads and transit, all the way to jails and recycling and disposal transfer stations.
Thank you. So there might be some confusion about, the basis of your view here today, and a typical property appraisal assessment that goes on. Why do you think that economic analysis is maybe more accurate than appraisal information? How are those different?
Yeah, I would say they're not distinctly different. Remember, the appraisal is simply a process that uses different kinds of tools. And economics is another way of understanding those effects. So many appraisers are actually economists, and they employ robust statistical tools, right? So within an appraiser's toolbox, they do lots of different things to sort of understand value on whether a specific property, a set of properties, or properties more generally. So for example, an assessor, right, might appraise a specific property and look at comparable sales, but then they also may run automated mass appraisals where they're running really complex statistical and regression models to estimate what they think the valuation of properties are.
And on the economic side, what kind of analyses are they doing in these HONE articles that you cite to?
Yeah, and so maybe to kind of back up, so in reviewing the pieces, right, I think the HONE research is trying to say there are these small studies, they have some consensus of what they think the impact is, but there's some differences, and they're saying, well, what we can do potentially to help provide more clarity is to do things in a much more robust fashion by looking at multiple settings, looking at multiple transactions, and saying we have a large sample size that we can infer from. And when you have those large sample sizes in the economic research, particularly when the question is around property values, there are really specific and appropriate tools for the treatment of those to understand what the effect is. And appraisers use these tools, economists use these tools. They're typically called hedonic regression. They're basically called hedonic analyses, or regression analyses are the same thing. But a regression analysis is really just trying to disentangle the dependent variable, what is the price, relative to a set of independent factors that are both endogenous to the property itself, like how big is the home, how big is the lot, what its characteristics, what kind of amenities does it have, as well as exogenous factors around like what happens within time, what's happening within sort of the local economy, that they can sort of then assess how all those independent factors relate back to the price. So what is really sort of that sort of explains the sort of components of how people make their decisions and value things on either residential or commercial side.
And after completing that hedonic analysis, where does Hohen land in terms of property value impacts from wind turbines and solar facilities?
Yeah, so he had a number of different studies, and each one of them, I would say, ratcheted up both the data set and economic sort of statistical power to examine the value, the impact of property values in North America. So looking at multi-states, multi-county, multi-facility, tens of thousands of transactions, they conclude that there is no consistent or longitudinal impact on property values from proximity to these wind turbine facilities.
So that's a broad analysis. Did Scout complete a site-specific analysis and submit it as a testimony?
Yes, I'm aware of a report that was done by Cohen Resnick to examine this issue.
You can continue, sorry.
Yeah, no, in that study, I think they really did 3 different pieces. The first piece was to really actually review the academic literature and provide a consensus view of what they think the impacts are. The second piece was actually to look at specific properties, specific wind farms. I believe there are 11 of them, and the impact on sales of adjacent residential properties. And they determined that the wind facilities had not caused any consistent or measurable negative impacts on property values. And then the third piece was actually to do a set of market participant interviews where they spoke with a range of county assessors and provided their perspective on what they thought the impact of those facilities were on home values in their respective counties.
And is that report?
I want to object to the testimony that characterizes other testimony in the proceeding. That we have a witness to testify about those things. I think that the testimony from this witness, essentially trying to rehabilitate his own testimony through reference to what other people have done, is inappropriate and should be stricken.
Ms. Schimmelfennig, any response?
Yes, Judge Torum. Mr. Rambrew asked extensive questions about local impacts and concerns of this project, and we just wanted to highlight that there is additional testimony on the record that provides that site-specific analysis that Mr. Rambrew was asking about, and Mr. Shook has reviewed that in advance of this hearing today.
Mr. Rambrew, I agree.
Sorry.
Mr. Rambrew, I agree that this is a little bit of referencing other testimony, but again, it'll go to weight. I'm going to overrule the objection and allow it. I hope, Ms. Schimmelfennig, now that we've established there's some other testimony the council will read or hear on this topic, that we can move ahead and just focus on what Mr. Shook said or what else needs to be responded to from Mr. Rambrew's cross-exam.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Rambrew asked you about your familiarity with the area and with the specifics of the project. Was reviewing, my apologies, the details of the application part of your expert review?
It was not part of my expert review.
And was that necessary to complete your analysis on property impacts?
It was not necessary because there's no independent sort of prospective analysis within the analysis that says that would estimate the effect of property values in a very sort of technical sense. What the socioeconomic analysis does is review the literature, right, and the level of that to sort of disclose to decision makers what they think the likely impacts would be in this case.
And Mr. Rambrew also asked you about visual assessments. Was a visual impact assessment part of your review?
It was not part of my review.
And why might the data that you did review show no negative property value impacts when some people maybe don't want to look at turbines on their property?
Yeah, so it's important to understand what these analyses are trying to do, right? They're trying to find consistent, measurable impacts. It does not necessarily mean that that a single property or single property buyer may be impacted, right? Some people obviously would have a strong preference one way or the other. Some people may have a preference for that, for reasons that may have to do with sort of the consciousness around clean energy. Some people may be completely agnostic or ambivalent to those views. And this is why when you look at the totality of those perspectives with respect to the revealed decisions that people make in terms of how much they are paying for property, this is why the analysis don't find any of those measurable impacts. Not that the fact that some people may be, but when you look at it in totality, they don't find any large scale impacts on property values.
And Mr. Rambu also discussed place attachment. Is that a concept relevant to your economic review?
That is not something I was asked to review.
And would consulting with local interest groups or an assessor or reading letters from local interest groups or tourism be part of academically accepted economic analysis?
No, it would not.
And can you explain why?
Yeah, so I would say the letters I reviewed all provided a set of opinions and or support, but did not point to any specific evidence or empirical claims to support some of those pieces. And so I think, like as I sort of stated earlier to Mr. Rambu, when we're doing research, that kind of perspective is important because we're trying to understand what the issues are, but we still have to then sort of marshal to forward a sort of research program, test it against the evidence, and see what the effects are. And I think that's what, when I'm looking at the Hone work, in particular, right, what we see is basically them weighing those perceptions, right? There's a reason they're looking at this property value question, and then that's why they are going to great lengths to actually do the investigation and to look at it exhaustively and robustly to see if there's any effects, because I think there obviously is, some perception out there, but when we look at it in totality, those perceptions don't actually turn into sort of material effects.
Thank you. Mr. Rambu also focused on the fact that there may exist other studies that conflict with the Berkeley lab reports. You stated that you hadn't specifically reviewed all of those other studies. Did the research you reviewed contain any, literature review or meta-analysis of those studies?
Yes, they did. And that review, typically research studies are always focused around, why is there a controversy? Why is this a question of interest, and particularly in this case to public policy? And so in that, they typically document, hey, in this case, some folks found no impacts. In some of these cases, some folks found some effects, negative effects. So what should we do with that conflicting information, right? We should try to conduct a much better and much more strong, to deal with the deficiencies of some of those other studies and try to look at this more robustly. And so, I would say it is not uncommon, right? And it is expected that that level of review to set up the import of the research question is included in these research reports.
And do you agree with their, literature comprehensive review?
I have no reason to believe that it is inaccurate. These are all peer-reviewed articles, and they must, obviously get passed through the review stage for both accuracy and veracity.
What does that review look like?
The peer review process?
Yeah.
The peer review process typically involves working with the publication, and the publication maintains sets of other researchers as part of its editorial and peer review board. And so, I published, in my experience, I've worked as a basic researcher and have gone through the peer review process, but typically you prepare a document for a draft for submittal to a publication. It is sent to these review panels. They'll either make the decision to to publish your paper or not to publish your paper. But within that published process, those reviewers may have some questions around evidence you're citing, applications you were doing, and they may ask for additional information, and in some cases ask for other kinds of robustness checks to make sure that the analysis is correct. And so the peer review process is meant to be kind of a quality assurance, quality control check on the research that is ultimately published in those journals. And so there's always typically some back and forth between the authors and the peer review board.
Thank you. My apologies for almost cutting you off there. I'm trying very hard to not talk over you. Based on your review and analysis of the HONE articles and the other things submitted in your testimony, was it necessary from an academic perspective to review those studies yourself?
The ones that they cited?
Yeah, the ones that you, sorry, the ones cited in the articles.
Yeah, the ones typically cited in the article, as you can see, most of them, they'll make a specific point, like we found this, and then they'll include where those findings were included. So typically, we take that at face value that those sites are correct.
And one sec, let me look and make sure I've answered all of my questions here, or you've answered all of my questions. Judge Torum, can I have a minute or two just to confer with counsel? I don't think I have any further questions. Oh, just kidding. I'm receiving confirmation that they don't need a moment to confer. So at this time, I end my questioning.
I'm going to come to the council members for questions, but in listening to all of this, Mr. Shook, I have a couple of my own. There's a lot of technical terms. As a lawyer, I hate to accuse another professional of jargon, but there's a lot of high-level words going on that are well outside my own expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered, for the issues in front of the council, these are great high-level explanations. But I think the bottom line that Mr. Aramburu is trying to make is, if one of the members in the community sells their house, they're afraid the property value is going to go down. Does your study address the sale of any individual houses with a view of the Horse Heaven Hills?
Again, I've done no independent analysis, right? And so,
right, so that's a yes. It's really a yes or no.
Yeah, no, nothing I've done there.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out, as the council makes its decision on what to recommend to the governor, when they take into account what's happening in the local area. We're going to hear plenty of public comment next Wednesday evening. I don't think it's going to follow the high-level jargon that we got in your report, but how can your testimony help this council understand what impact or not this renewable energy facility is going to have in Benton County and the Tri-Cities area?
Mm-hmm.
Can you summarize that in a couple sentences? What should they take? What's the takeaway?
Yeah, I would say in a lot of times there is perception outweighs sort of reality with respect to the impact on property values. Not that these things aren't important, but other things are much more important, right, with respect to why people buy their homes, right? The quality of the home, the school district, perhaps. And so the question that researchers are trying to say is, well, can we find an effect around how close you are or your views to these facilities? And when we look at this robustly, we find that there really is no consistent effect or long-term effect of it. And so I think the guidance that the research tells us related to the public conversation on this is that is that some people may not prefer it, other people are agnostic to it, and some people might actually prefer it, right? In some cases because of the issues around clean energy. And so when we look at that in totality, we don't see any strong impact on how people are paying, how that materializes in property value. So for example, right, you could have one person who says, I will never live next to a wind turbine facility. I'm not going to pay any money for it. But you can have another buyer who says, I don't really care, right? I'll pay whatever the market price is for it. So we see no effect on that sale. So that's maybe a good way to understand some of that counterfactual around, even though some people may choose not to, there are a lot more buyers and people who are agnostic to it that we don't see it actually impact what homes actually sell for.
Okay, I appreciate the takeaway there. You talked a little bit about your studies with logistics centers and data centers and jails. Would you agree with me? Those are qualitatively different in at least their appearance and their proximity to individual houses than an energy facility that's spread out over multiple miles like this one.
Yeah, I would agree. Really, a wind facility is not a large warehouse building. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to,
Yeah.
when I heard you talking about those things, I know out in our Columbia Basin, there are plenty of data centers in Grant County and Adams County and the rest along the river. This is along a different portion of the river, but I just wanted to confirm with you this. Would you agree this would have a different sort of market impact?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, the complicated part here related to some of those industrial facilities. So we've looked at jails, right, which have a perception of having a big public safety impact, right? Nobody wants to live next to a jail. Turns out one of the safest places to live is actually next to a jail. When you actually look at the data, this is the kind of like counterintuitive side of it. We've also looked at the siting of a transfer station, right? And so nobody wants to live next to a transfer station, right? And so I would say in the sense that that there is a perception around disamenities, right? So things that give less value in terms of perception, but then when you actually look at them from a property value impacts, like the actual revealed behavior of market participants is a little different than you might expect. So I think that would be the way I would say that obviously they're similar, and obviously in the ways that they're different, they're just different structures, and they interact with people's thinking about how they might want to sort of buy or live in a home differently.
All right, I will take that there are alternate perceptions of reality for buyers, sellers, and for others, for academics, and then what I would call people in the real world. So we'll take it from there, from my understanding, and now really the people that matter are the council. Chair Drew, members of the council, any questions for Mr. Shook? I see Eli Levitt is ready from the Department of Ecology. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious, as it sounds like kind of an economist in your general expertise, are you aware of the terms climate adaptation, climate resiliency, or climate mitigation?
I am aware of those, yes.
Okay, and your general expertise, it sounds like you've done some work in the Tri-City areas. Are you aware if the city, county, Tri-City Cares, or other organizations are doing things to prepare for future impacts, such as extreme heat days, increased flooding, increased risk of wildfire?
I'm not aware of anything specifically in the Tri-Cities, but we work in many communities where these issues are important and increasingly topics of public policy conversation.
As an economist or someone studying the valuation of homes and communities, is it fair to say that these sorts of risks in the future will impact property values depending on the assessment, and which risks are the most significant?
Yes. There's already data that suggests, particularly in places that might be prone to wildfire incidents, right, that there is a less willingness to pay in those homes. I think I've seen some research out of the Northern California experience that suggests that might be the case.
Yeah, in this particular community, sea level rise is not an issue, but I imagine Oregon, Washington, California. I think I have one more question. Just let me see if it's. Yeah, I guess one thing I'll point out is my understanding of the University of Washington climate impact tools and recent reports is that extreme heat days in Eastern Washington will double between the 2050s and 2080s. So going to about an average of 20 to 48 extreme heat days for Western Washington and 23 to 47 extreme heat days for Eastern Washington. Do you think extreme heat days could potentially impact the value of homes in the Tri-City areas?
And certainly, right. So when these hedonic analyses are done, right, they're trying to look at the totality of these factors. Like I said, endogenous ones around the property itself and exogenous factors, right? And so things like extreme heat days and the quality of the environment all show up, and they would show up consistently across properties, right? And I think this is part of the challenge, I would say, with these property value impacts, right? It's a very narrow, in my opinion, examination of the issues related to residents, right? So they're just looking at that sort of home value piece. And what is kind of showing is trying to say, like, with these facilities, are there, potentially positive impacts, right, of the project? It's hard to know what those are and how they accrue, right? And that's cited in some of the literature. But then there's obviously just the sort of what people perceive as sort of the negative impacts around views. And they're trying to weigh those two things. But the things that you're talking about would be kind of in that sort of like exogenous things, like, well, are there things that we can't see, can't measure, that are actually, potentially boosting, right, or mitigating those effects? And that's why you don't see the property value impacts. And I believe there's some discussion in those reports that talk about those things.
Okay, maybe last question at a very general level, your general expertise. For those communities that do less to prepare for a changing future, do you believe there's increased risk, at least economically, for those communities in terms of the value of commercial or private, residential properties?
Yeah, so this is actually something I do spend some time in my practice working on, is on community resiliency, and making particular sort of infrastructure investments to make communities more resilient. And we just see when we look at this question from a basic research question, right, the level of sort of, I'm not talking about sort of on the environmental side, but just simply understanding kind of the amount of infrastructure that is meant to sort of promote sort of the adequacy of roads, the adequacy of utilities. Those all show up in sort of property value impacts.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Mr. Livingston, I see you have your hand up as well.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Shook, so I'm a wildlife biologist and in my past, administrator now. I really appreciated all the literature you provided, and I have to admit I've only read the abstracts for everything, but I certainly want to go back and dig into those a little bit more deeper as time allows. My question is, and the one exhibit that we spent quite a bit of time on, 1011, had a table, and it showed study areas, and it showed Nine Canyon. There was a couple sites, southeastern Washington and Oregon, for some of these studies, but I'm curious if there's other of that literature you provided, study areas that are similar to what we're looking at in eastern Washington, so that we can compare apples to apples, because some of these, nationwide, these projects are happening all over in various different land covers, different types of communities. And so the relevance of those studies to the very site-specific conditions in the Tri-Cities seems to be an important question in my mind anyway. So I'm hoping that you can help me understand that. And then I think I'll have one more after this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, actually. So like of the literature and the analysis that's been done, like what's the relevance to this specific issue, right? And obviously there's no kind of like, here's the perfect facility that's just like the Horse Heaven site and it's in, Franklin County kind of thing, right? Like that is not something that one can point to. And so the way to think about the research that's been provided is, there is, my understanding of the literature, looking and reading this, is that there are all these different small studies, like, oh, here's one here of 50 turbines and we have 500 transactions. What did we find, right? Kind of thing. And then you see that all across the country. And so what the HONE work is trying to do is bring all that together and say, can we look at that mix of settings from sort of of ruralness, right, relative to urbanness, and say, do we see consistent effects across those settings? And I think the research shows that basically it's not saying like, oh, hey, if you're in this setting, you have a different effect. If you're in this setting, you have a different effect. They're seeing fairly consistent effects across those multiple settings. Are any of those things really exactly like the Tri-Cities piece? No, I mean, they just don't have that level of resolution, right, to do kind of like, here's, hundreds of turbines right next to, a large metropolitan area in South Central Washington, right? But they do have sort of places across the country, if you look at that map and that exhibit, right, that have similarities to those settings with respect to sort of urbanness, metro areas close to in more rural settings, perhaps, or more isolated settings. And I think that's the best level of confidence one can draw from those pieces, which is better than nothing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we hear this question and concern all the time, and it's always in the back of my mind, what is the validity of that, and how much should we be weighing of those concerns? The other question is, and it was brought up earlier, is just the scale of this project relative to some of the others. And you mentioned close to a metropolitan area. And how does that, how did the studies, the literature you provided, compare to our site-specific nature in that regard too?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the exact sort of all the references, but I remember them having kind of a few large ones, but many kind of mid-sized ones as part of their data set in terms of the number of turbines in many of these studies. And so all to say it's mixed in there, but in the control check, they remember them not really finding any strong relationship between sort of increasing numbers of turbines in that. But that would be something we'd have to sort of double check. But off the top of my memory, I don't recall that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Any other council questions? All right, I see Ms. Volkers, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Your Honor. If I may, I have a question prompted by actually what you were asking earlier. If I may ask it now.
Let me, Mr. Rambrew, would you indulge me coming to Yakima Nation before I come back to you for any recross?
That's perfectly fine with me.
All right, Ms. Volkers, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Shook. I represent Yakima Nation in this proceeding, and I will readily admit that I myself have read more of the abstracts than all the literature that you've provided. But I really appreciated your answers to Judge Torn that kind of distilled this down. So I think what you said in response to one of his questions was that there's no consistent long-term effect expected based upon the research that you've reviewed. Is that fair?
That's a fair characterization.
Okay, so what about the short-term effect? Are you speaking today about the short-term effect? And actually, also, how do you, when I say short-term and long-term effect, how are you looking at that?
Oh, yes. So I'll be clear. One of the Hone studies, I can't remember which one, was, I think I might have been the 2016 one, the most recent one where they did the large-scale one, actually was trying to look at time effects and to see like, well, you can't just look at it from whether after, like where is the point in time that you try to say, where does the effect start, right? And basically, is it at construction? Is it the end of construction? Is it at the announcement of the facility? And so what they did was to try to look at the effects at those different sort of time intervals. And what they found is that there was no, when they say long-term effect, they didn't see any effect sizes showing up at those different kind of time benchmarks that you might want to evaluate sort of when to start, kind of like, do we see a property impact, right? Because people in the literature is basically saying, like, hey, we don't see any property impacts once the facility is constructed. But then if you look back and say, oh, it was announced like 5 years ago, and then you saw a property value impact. And so what they did in the research was to try to be aware of those at issue and to look at that research question. And so, as best of my understanding from their research, is they weren't finding any consistent effect across those different announcement or time periods.
And for this project, are you monitoring those different time periods to see if specifically for this project there has already been an effect, or there might be if the project were permitted? Is there a plan to monitor that?
My engagement was really just to look at the materials and research that's in here, but I don't have an answer or understanding of that. Maybe somebody else might be better suited to answer that question.
Okay, and maybe my final question is better suited for someone else, but I don't want to miss this opportunity because you don't have opportunity to recall everyone. What is the plan then if the project is permitted and it does impact property values? What's the plan for that possibility? I understand that your testimony is that that's not what you think is going to happen, but what's the plan if that does happen?
I don't know. And I'm probably not the best person to answer that question.
Okay, thank you. And that's all for me, Judge Trump.
Thank you. Mr. Rambrew, did you have any recross?
Oh, yes, just a couple of questions. And I do want to observe, Judge Torm, that some of the questions seem to be attempting to make a tie between this project and climate change, which was something that you ruled out of order during the course of particularly PHO number 2. I just want to make that observation that there
Let
seems
me
to
just
be.
respond. Let me respond that the council members are not privy to all of our pre-hearing orders necessarily, Mr. Rambrew. And again, the scope of what's before them for the adjudication will certainly go over in deliberations, but I appreciate where Mr. Levitt's questions were coming from. And certainly if you want to inquire within the scope of those, if that's where you're going, yeah, totally permitted given the development of the record today. But again, I don't want to open that can of worms beyond what I've ruled with the parties. I'm not going to, again, limit the fact finders on what might influence their findings on what is appropriate for the adjudication. I do believe also, Mr. Rambrew, in the context we put it, the information for SEPA may do some of that analysis, and the council members are looking at that, the entire record before the recommendation that goes to the governor. So again, the adjudication is limited, as I've said. Some of those comments might inform their decisions on the SEPA documents and the long-awaited FEIS.
And it's a point I don't want to belabor, but we continue to believe that the FEIS should be available to the parties in this adjudication. I made that point before. I won't belabor it. I think that is error on your part not to require that.
Noted.
Okay. Now, Mr. Shook, have you seen any tie between the building of this project and the reduction of the number of hot days in the Tri-Cities?
Are you speaking about specific analysis? I've not.
Yes, have you seen anything to support that?
I've not seen any analysis.
You seen any analysis that would suggest that property values may be affected by the whether or not a property owner might approve the project if they thought it was going to reduce the number of heat days?
Consistent with my previous statement, I haven't seen any analysis that within the Tri-Cities generally or a specific property owner in this case.
Okay, and in looking at the Honig studies, the various ones that were done, how many of those were done in the state of Washington for state of Washington properties?
I don't have the list of those properties. Maybe there was one at the Washington-Oregon border, but I can't recall now.
Okay, and do you remember whether there were any done for Oregon?
I don't recall.
Would you agree that property values and values of property owners differ between the state of Washington and, say, central Nebraska?
I mean, that's true for any property. Are you talking about whether the state effect, there's an effect related to the state when we control for all the other factors, there's a impact on price?
Yes.
I'm not aware of any research that says for a similar conditioned house that it should sell less because you're in a specific state. But yeah, I think your point is, are different homes priced differently depend on where they are? Yes, because they all have either specific site characteristics that are similar or different, but they also have different exogenous things that they're related to, like what's the quality of your school district, what's your taxation like, what's your public safety like, and those all vary by location.
Would it not be the case that the impact on property values from wind turbine project would relate to the specific resource that's being damaged by the wind turbines? I'll take the word damaged out. I'll say impacted by the wind turbines.
Which resource are we talking about?
The impact. Wind turbines don't exist in a vacuum, do they? They have impact on a certain thing, correct?
Well, that's in the property value analysis. That's exactly what they're trying to understand, is whether or not the location proximity of the wind turbine is having property value impacts.
So would you agree with me that just looking at a wind turbine next door would be different than looking at a wind turbine on a piece of iconic topography that might exist in a community, such as the Horsehaven Hills?
There are for certain differences, right, with respect to the facility, where it is, what those views look at, right? And that's a confounding thing in this issue, and also for all the research that's been done, right? Is to say, like, we don't have kind of the exact thing that one can point to definitively. So we have to kind of look at all the evidence where there's mixes and matches of it, right? And because you have mixes and matches and confounding things, you need appropriate statistical tools to hone in on specifically what the issue, what the, in your case, the impact is, right? In this case, the proximity to the wind turbine. And when they've done this, like the Hone research, when they do this robustly, I think, to repeat their finding, right, they just don't find that there's property value impacts.
But does the Hone research separate out the impacts of wind turbines on particular features in a community, as opposed to just being next door in a flat plain, something of that nature? Are those kinds of distinctions made?
I'd have to double check on the specificity, but I know in their data records they have information about the property and some characteristics that are in there. But to the extent that you're talking about very specific and precise information, to the extent that that is not like recorded as part of your assessor or part of your the administrative data, typically then that is not reflected in the analysis.
So for the most part, the honing studies are really large scale studies, are they not? Considering a variety of circumstances and a variety of locations put into a single study.
Correct.
That's a yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So, Ms. Mazengale, I hate to impose upon you again, but could you put Exhibit 5903 back up on the screen? And the first page, please. So if you could just scroll down a bit so I have the first full sentence. So I'm gathered you've talked a great deal about Mr. Honig and the research that he's done, but isn't really what Mr. Honig is doing is trying to figure out ways to make wind turbines more acceptable to the community?
I would think that he's trying to understand the effects of it, and public acceptance seems to be a controversial issue, which his research is dedicated to, is my understanding here.
But his research is really dedicated to figuring out ways that wind turbines can be made more acceptable to the public, so more wind turbine facilities can be installed. Isn't that the case?
On what basis am I supposed to make that determination?
In the abstract of the article that we 5903 that we put up, would you take a look at the last sentence, please?
With continued research efforts and a commitment towards implementing research findings into developer and policymaker practice, conflict and perceived injustices around proposed and existing wind energy facilities might be significantly lessened.
So he's working on ways to figure out how objections to wind turbines can be significantly lessened. Isn't that the point of this article?
I think the point of the article is just a meta-analysis of the key issues with respect to what the academics know about the siting of these facilities.
Okay, should we look at Mr. Honig's research in light of his desire that objections to wind turbines should be significantly lessened?
Objection asked and answered.
Well, Ms. Schimmelfang, I'm not sure that the witnesses really answered it. But Mr. Aramburu, I think you've made your point that this is a professional study looking to mitigate consumer and community feelings against being located next to a wind facility. I think you've made that point.
Thank you.
Any other questions? While you're thinking, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, there was, you answered a number of questions regarding the apparent deficiencies in other studies that have been done that are inconsistent with the Hone conclusions. Did you not?
I don't believe I testified to the specific deficiencies of any individual report.
Well, it's been identified that there are problems with these other reports, and that Hone seems to conclude that his research supports the reduction or the lessening of impacts from wind turbines on property values. Do you have in mind what's wrong with those other reports? How come we can't rely on those other reports and use them in our analysis of property values?
Yeah, so I would say, right, science is a process trying to understand these things, and they are always a feature of our understanding, and that evolves, right? And so what Hone is trying to do, right, is people, obviously, this is a controversial issue, and people are trying to understand it, and they have done commissioned reports, or researchers have taken a look at this, and there seems to be a preponderance, at least at the time, right, a preponderance evidence that they don't, but there are these other studies, right, that are disclosed, right, front and center in these analyses that maybe there are some negative effects. And so what researchers are trying to do is say, like, well, why are we seeing conflicting things? And if we sort of basically build a better analysis, can we sort of understand why those things are happening, or adjudicate some of those pieces? And so think of it as basically not necessarily to say anybody necessarily is wrong, but it's just to evolve our thinking on these things by considering more information, doing stronger technical work on those things, so that we can get closer to sort of better information. And that's how I look at the research that's been done in this. Like, it's hard to do these very complex studies, and particularly when you have kind of one side over here, one side over here, right? There's so many different idiosyncratic issues that are related to either the availability of data, the timing of when they were done, right? And so as a researcher, you want to kind of step back and say, like, well, if we're going to say what we think the consensus is, can we take a look at this in multiple settings, multiple characteristics with much more statistical power, to sort of arrive at a conclusion, which he does in his work. So I mean, so that's I don't necessarily see him as basically saying those studies were deficient, right? It's really just say, like, we all these projects have their limitations, but the best thing we can do is marshal the evidence that we have to sort of provide that information to decision makers.
Well, that was not my question. My question was, there are dissenting reports, there are dissenting studies that have been presented, and Mr. Hone, in his report, Exhibit 5903, says, yes, there are conflicting reports. What's wrong with those reports? Did these people fail the math part of SAT? What's wrong with these reports that we can't use them? I understand the idea we're going to throw it all into some big pot and stir it around, but I want to know what your perception is as to why the report, for example, from Mr. Fast, on page 14 of 5903, or Heinzelman, what's wrong with those reports?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to go back and look, but I recall.
Objection. Sorry. My apologies, Mr. Schick. Objection asked and answered. The witness stated that there was nothing wrong with those reports, and that this was an evolving science and that they built upon the previous reports. And so he has answered the question.
I think it's fair to ask him. He says, perhaps in general, the reports are fine. It's just that I think to help the council and the parties, what's wrong with those reports? Some specifics would be helpful here. Generalities don't help.
Yeah,
Mr. Shook, are you able, before I rule on the objection, are you able to answer that concisely, report by report?
Yeah, I can't answer report by report. The only thing I was going to add is that the Hone study, I think in one of them, talks specifically about why they're doing this, because previous studies suffered from small sample sizes. It's kind of one of the big issues of why to take a look at this more exhaustively.
All right, Ms. Schimfeld, I guess I'm just going to, looking back, just to allow it and overrule the objection. Mr. Rambro, I don't know if it's worth belaboring this point with this particular witness.
I agree with that, but I would still like an answer to my question as to what if you can identify specific omissions, errors, deficiencies in these contrary reports.
Like I said, I've not reviewed any of those reports and evaluated their kind of robustness, right? All I can recall is in one of the Hone reports is one of the reasons they were doing this and looking at that conflicting research was that a lot of times those reports really kind of suffered from small sample sizes, which means you actually have very large standard errors around your estimates. And so that's probably one of the reasons why you undertake more robust, more thorough investigation.
You're speculating as to these factors, are you not? You're saying they're probably a small sample size, a specific report?
I believe.
Objection, Your Honor. The witness has answered this question many times now.
Mr. Rambro, I think he has answered it to the best that you're ever going to get out of him and best assistance we're going to get to the council. It's vague, and he just hasn't done the specific reading that apparently you have. So let's either move on.
Well, I thought my question was a yes or no, but it turned out to be much more than that. So
I thought it was yes or no too,
for
the record. I just don't think you're going to get a yes or a no. We just haven't had that with this witness, and I don't think either of us are going to get any better luck.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I have.
All right,
Thank you
Mr.
again,
Rambro, I have two questions for you. are you moving the admission of Exhibit 5903X?
I am.
Right? Any objections to that in the context of
Quorum.
cross-exam? Yes, Ms. Schimmelfennig.
Yes, we have no objections, but we would like Mr. Rambrew provide us the entire report since this was only a small section of it.
I think Mr. Rambrew probably has access to it. So in the collaborative nature, the parties have been working behind the scenes. If he has it, he'll send it to you. And one other point, Mr. Rambrew, maybe again, like you said, you weren't sure on the pronunciation. There was a Hoen, H-O-E-N, and we saw that name on the screen. And then a few times it sounded as though you said Honig. Is that the same person?
I'm more used to the second name. So every time I said Honig, I meant Hoen, H-O-E-N, and I apologize for misspeaking.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed a report of my own. And then as long as the council members are all clear that H-O-E-N or H-O-E-N-I-G, as it might appear in the transcript, are referring to the same expert. Okay. Were there any other questions we needed to pose to Mr. Shook? Ms. Schimmelfennig has her hand up. Yes, ma'am. If it's really concise, I'll allow it.
Yes, Judge Torum, we just have one question based on questions from the council that we would like to ask Mr. Shook.
Please do.
Okay, thank you. Judge Torum asked you about your actual local impacts from the project. In addition, Councilmember Livingston also asked you a similar question about region-specific impacts and the scale of the project. Are those things that a project-specific report of analogous project impacts like Mr. Lyons Cohen-Resnick reports would answer?
Yes, that report would shed some light on those issues.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Schimmelfennig. Mr. Shook, thank you for your time this morning and taking us into a place that many of us maybe never have been. But I appreciate the angle you bring to this and the information you provided to the council. We'll let you go. And I'm going to ask the parties if there was anything else that we had scheduled on the record today. Ms. Schimmelfennig, are you aware as you look around your office there, if anybody's flagging and saying there's more to do today?
None, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Harper?
Nothing, Your Honor.
Ms. Reineveld?
Nothing, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Volkers.
Thank you, Your Honor. I do have one point while we're still on the record with the council that I'd like to ask for clarification on.
Certainly.
Council for Yakima Nation with clarification on something that has been discussed over the last couple of years, the Nine Canyon project. It featured prominently in land use testimony and in questions from the Siting Council. We are concerned that this is being brought into the adjudication without foundation, without evidence in the record to orient ourselves or other parties to the questions and answers, and without support in Benton County's land use laws, which doesn't actually contemplate comparison of new conditional uses with previously permitted conditional uses. So we would appreciate instruction and clarification from your honor before the adjudication hearing proceeds next week.
Thank you. It's a good point, Ms. Volkers. And I think, as I said this morning, the questions of council members give you an idea of what they're interested in. We did have in Ms. McLean's testimony a number of supporting exhibits that referenced the Nine Canyon project. So those are in the record as support for her testimony. Any of the other documents that come in, there won't be any other documents coming in unless there's something introduced by the parties. And between Mr. Thompson and I instructing the council members on what the limits of the record are, you can be assured that if it hasn't been entered as an exhibit, it won't be a basis for the decision, findings, conclusions, or the recommendation. There were some testimony also, I think, from Mr. Wendt on what a board of adjudication, I think it was, something along those lines, how they were permitting that project. And definitely his testimony reflected it was on a different standard, a different set of approaches that are currently before the Benton County code that exists when this project was applied for. So clearly, the law we're operating under for the land use topics and the development of what conditional uses, if any, would be recommended by this council interpreting Benton County's code. That's the rules. not anything that was before with Desert Canyon. I hope that sets aside any worries as to perceptions and maybe helps the council members put this week's testimony in context.
Nothing further from your acclamation. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Rambrew?
And nothing for today, and not to put pressure on you, Ms. Torn, but in preparation for witness testimony next week, it will be very helpful for me to know your rulings on the various issues. So that are outstanding.
Right. And for the council, I have a number of motions that I've been deciding, some on the fly here in the last couple of days to catch up. And I do still owe the council or the parties a ruling on some community member testimony and other witnesses that are speaking for the community as a whole that Mr. Aramburu has submitted. Particularly those witnesses, you might have seen some of their pre-filed testimony from Mr. Crouppen, Mr. Sharp, Mr. Dunn, and Mr. Simon. Those are a work in progress as to what portions will or won't be admitted. And I'm still working on some motions there. So as you read for next week, keep that in mind. There may be some redlined versions or revised versions coming that limit, or perhaps in some cases, based on a motion for reconsideration, expand what's in the SharePoint files for you to review. And again, Mr. Aramburu, I'm going to make sure when we talk about those community impacts for deliberations that we reemphasize and re-review the ultimate evidentiary rulings that bring information and evidence in front of the council. I do owe it to you. I'm running late. My apologies on the record. Perhaps today, like I say, when I'm back in Ellensburg, it'll be another late night, but the last one until next week.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, council members, any questions that you have about where things stand before we come back into adjudicative hearing next Monday at 9 a.m.? All right, we'll take a recess of the hearing going forward until next Monday. Council members, you can expect to see a revised schedule at some point as to telling you what Monday's Monday, it's what you already have, and what's coming the rest of the week. Please indulge me if we need to go late on Tuesday or add a little bit of time on Wednesday. We might take an early lunch and have a short session and then still have time before the public comment hearing that evening. But as you look at your personal and work schedules, if you can accommodate that and be here for the sessions, all the better. Also, party members, I think there's been our Department of Agriculture rep is going to have to review the 2.5 days we've done this week. My understanding is that he had a conflict this entire week and hopefully can get up to speed between now and Monday. But we expect him to be here all of next week is what I've been informed. So in case anybody's wondering. All right, that's all I have for you. So we'll adjourn the hearing for today. I'll imagine I'll hear or see most of you on the council's monthly meeting at 1:30. Thank you.